So for example, of all the people I could have sex with, and again, sex doesn't take a lot of time, but it takes some time. If I have a choice of people to have sex with, from an evolutionary standpoint, I want to make sure I'm having sex with a person who's likely to get pregnant and have my child. So anything associated with fertility in a partner, I should prefer. Well, what kind of things are associated with fertility? It turns out, clear skin, youth, health. So if the challenge is to get access for men, since they don't have to invest much more than that, men should have evolved psychological mechanisms that help them to solve that problem, help them to get access to fertile females. If the challenge for women is to get protection while they're gestating this precious single child, they should have evolved psychological mechanisms that help them solve that problem, that alert them to the presence of men who are capable of protecting them and investing in their child. Well, according to evolutionary psychology, that's what happened. And that's what happened 30 or 40,000 years ago, and the product was us. And the result is, according to evolutionary psychology, if they say if we're right, then these mechanisms should characterize the human species. And men and women should differ in these ways, anywhere that you measure. Now, well, there's some of you, this is not a non-controversial idea. And if some of you are finding this controversial, that's okay. And we'll get to that in a moment. But that's a lot of thinking. So far, that's all thinking, talking, and thought experiments. So what kind of research would you do? Is there a way to test this theory? There is. And a lot of the research starts, and some of it ends, by predicting and explaining gender differences. It follows directly from the theory of parental investment. The theory of parental investment says, since men and women are so differentially invested in the production of offspring, then men and women should have evolved very different psychological mechanisms, and especially different preferences for mates and different responses to relationship behavior. So, and this should be true in the human species, because this should have evolved before there was Chinese and American, before there was people in Australia and people in Alaska. It should have evolved when we were all just one close living together species, so it should still be true, since in evolutionary terms, no time has passed. So let's see if it's true. And people like David Buss have done a lot of research saying, I think that I can explain male and female gender differences in attraction and in mate selection and in other sort of intimate relationship processes, like, for example, jealousy. One of David Buss's most famous studies asks people a simple question. He started in college students, and he gave them a simple question. I'm going to ask you this question. I'm not asking you to, you don't have to announce your answer, just think about it. Here's the question. Which of these is worse for you? Which of these situations would you find most intolerable? 1, your mate is emotionally committed to you but sexually unfaithful. They have sex with someone else, doesn't mean anything though, emotionally you're it. Or this other situation, which is your mate is sexually faithful to you but has an emotional connection with someone else. A crush or a passionate communication via email or whatever. You see the issue. Which is worse? Sexual infidelity or emotional infidelity? Play with that. Think about it. Roll it around in your head a little bit. My partner's having had sex with somebody else, but they still love me, versus my partner's still having sex just with me, but sort of has this thing going on with someone else. They aren't having sex, but they have this thing, this connection. They're like sharing intimacies over coffee. Which is worse for you? Well, raise your hand if you have an answer, if you really do have a strong preference for one over the other. Not that many hands up, so some people can't decide. Well, what Buss did is he forced the question. He said, make a choice, damn it. And what he found in college students was very clear. Big difference between genders. Predict the effects. Which gender found the emotional infidelity worse? Correct. And which gender found the sexual infidelity worse? Men. And he said that's perfectly explained by evolutionary theory, because think about it. If you're a woman, and you're a cave woman living in a cave, and you need your male protector to protect you, especially while you're immobile in the longest late stages of pregnancy. So if you discover that your man had sex with somebody else, but is still back with you, taking care of you, giving you all the saber-toothed tiger meat when he comes back from the hunt, you're not thrilled by sexual infidelity, don't get me wrong. But at least you're getting a lot of other things that you need. Could be worse. But on the other hand, if your man is in love with somebody else, well, he might then give the saber-toothed tiger meat to that other person he likes better than you. Now, that's going to be worse. He might not take care of your kids. That's going to be worse. So yeah, the emotional infidelity is more threatening. What if you're a man living in that same cave? For you, the big problem is, if I'm giving you and this child my saber-toothed tiger meat, it had better be my child. Because evolutionarily speaking, the worst thing for me would be to give you all my resources for someone else's kid. That would be terrible. But how can I know whether it's my kid or not? It looks kind of like me, but it looks a little bit like George over there too. Well, if I'm a cave guy, here's what I got to do. I've got to evolve. I've got to have psychological mechanisms alerting me to fidelity, to making sure that you are sexually faithful. Because if you're sexually unfaithful, then you might be having someone else's kid, and that will trick me, and it will be very bad for me. So men should say, sexual infidelity, no. Go ahead, have all the crushes you want, but no sexual infidelity. And that's what his college students found. Kind of neat. But here's what David Buss went further. He went and he asked that same question in 36 countries across the world, in industrialized nations, in moderately industrialized nations, in non-industrialized nations, in Amazonian tree people tribes, in Aborigine tribes, in every other kind of situation. And he always got the same effect, no matter what. He always found that women were more threatened by emotional infidelity, men were more threatened by sexual infidelity. And he said, look, and this is what David Buss says in talks. He says, have I proven that this has evolved? No. But you do a better job. Go ahead, you explain, better than I have, why men and women all over the planet Earth have this difference. And I don't think you can do it, says David Buss. I don't think you can do it. But I have a theory that explains, doesn't just say men and women are different, it says here's how they're different and why. Now, that's not the only thing he does. He also looks at mate preferences. So, for example, let me just ask you, take a guess, pop quiz. Don't pull out any paper, we'll just do this orally. Which gender is more likely to be attracted to a partner that's older than themselves? Good guess. Which gender is more likely to... wait, you did say women, right? Which gender is more likely to be attracted to a mate that's shorter than themselves? Men. He says, now, that's obvious, right? You didn't have to guess, but why is it true? It's one thing to say, yeah, men and women are different, but why? Why is it true? Explain to me why that should be true. David Buss says evolutionary theory doesn't just describe it, it explains it. It says, yes, there's a reason. There's a reason why human beings evolved this way, because that preference is true all over the planet Earth. You can look at tribal peoples, you can look at industrial peoples. Men are vastly more likely to be partnered with mates that are younger than themselves and shorter than themselves. And women are vastly more likely to be partnered with mates that are older than themselves and taller than themselves. Because men are looking for youth and fertility, and women are looking for resources and protection. So we got to, not only do they find these differences, but they find them everywhere. Now, here's where I need to make a point, because people can easily misunderstand this. Okay. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, yeah, that's fine for industrialized nations or whatever, 36 countries. But I am a student at UCLA, and I assure you that when I look for a mate, I am not thinking about that person's reproductive fitness. Question, Cassie.
How does this theory apply to same-sex?
Yeah, well, to same-sex couples? Yeah. Oh, great question. Here's how. Same-sex couples are, by definition, they both are of the same sex. So now you should have two people who have comparable preferences. And so sometimes some of the stuff will fall out and not be relevant in same-sex relationships, but some of the stuff will still be quite relevant. We'll actually be talking about this, I think it's next week, in more detail. But for now, let me say that, for example, evolutionary psychology says that men should be much more interested in having sex with multiple partners than women. We just said that a moment ago. Well, if that's true, then even in same-sex relationships between men should be much more open or accepting of extra-relational sexual activity than same-sex relationships between women. And study after study shows that's true. On the other hand, what's interesting about same-sex relationships is it allows us to tease apart preferences associated with sexual orientation and preferences associated with gender. And a lot of research has actually tried to do that in really interesting and provocative ways, which we'll talk about next week. But what I thought you were actually asked when you heard your question was, I thought you said, how does this account for safe sex as opposed to same sex? Like, what about people who, wear condoms or aren't interested in reproduction at all? It's like, no, here's the last thing I want, reproduction. Well, that's irrelevant. Because the point of the theory is not that that you're consciously saying, I want resources or I want fertility. No. What's conscious is a preference for something. It so happens that that something in our ancestral past was a cue to resources, protection, or fertility. Today, it might not be. But that doesn't matter. The preference hasn't changed. Let me say that again, because that's crucial to avoid a deep misunderstanding that many people have about this theory. If I am out and about and I see a potential partner, I'm not saying, hey, fertile. All I'm saying is, hey, clean skin, straight teeth, curvy body, young, that's attractive. Now, why is that attractive? Why isn't big, round and attractive? Why is that attractive? It's attractive, according to evolutionary theory, because in our ancestral past, people who had those things were more fertile. Nowadays, it may not be associated with fertility. You may be less fertile, maybe. But the preference hasn't changed yet, hasn't caught up. You understand? We didn't evolve a preference for fertility. No, we evolved a preference for cues that in our ancestral past signaled fertility. Even if those cues don't signal fertility anymore, even if we're not thinking about fertility, the preference for the cues remains. And it does. Even if you're not thinking of fertility. Women frequently say, I'm not thinking of fertility, I'm just telling you what I like. It just happens to be big and broad. Which gender is more likely to say, I like my partners to be broad in the shoulder and big and bulky and burly?